go into meetings and beg that your government officials will do the right thing when it comes to protecting your environment. And in fact, our entire legal structure right now, our entire system of government, when it comes to the environment, is focused on permitting and managing the how, the when, the where we allow pollution and degradation to take place. It is not focused on prevention of harm. And that's because we don't have this recognition of the environment as a right of all people, including future generations, that must be honored and respected and protected from the beginning of the decision-making process, not just left to the end when all we can do is think about how we're going to manage it.
That's good stuff. That is about as much emotion as anyone has showed on Tree Hugger Podcast. At the center of our story on this episode is Maya van Rossum. She is the founder of Green Amendments for the Generations, a grassroots nonprofit organization inspiring a nationwide movement to secure constitutional recognition and protection of environmental rights in every state and ultimately at the federal level. We caught up to chat remotely as she settled into quarantine in New Mexico to continue her community-powered work in that state. So, there's an election coming up, and I thought we should probably earmark an episode to talk about politics, laws, and our rights. This election is focused on a few issues such as COVID, racism, and the economy, of course. But for the first time ever, 70 million people or so at each debate are seeing the major parties stand or sit and discuss the climate. And fracking even came up in the vice presidential debate. Then at the next match, we get to see them fumble around some answers about environmental justice. No one seems to recall an environmental justice question during a presidential debate, which is long overdue, decades after communities of color branded environmental justice as a civil rights issue. One candidate whose administration has endeavored to reverse over 100 environmental regulations related to clean air and water basically responds by gaslighting us, saying black and brown people breathing and living near pollution, near toxic industries are fine because they have jobs and inexpensive gasoline. The other candidate uses the term fence line and frontline communities and discusses how his team will transition the country from fossil fuels. Fence line communities are those located closest to oil and natural gas refineries, also disproportionately African American. It seems like a clean environment and climate change have jumped up on the list of visible public priorities if occurrence in the presidential debates is any reasonable metric to measure. So, this feels like an opportune time for the topic of this episode. Maya van Rossum is an attorney by training. She is like a lawyer for the earth. Now, she doesn't represent nature itself, but represents people's claims to a healthy environment. Maya is also the Delaware Riverkeeper. She leads the watershed-based advocacy organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, for 25 years in its efforts to protect the health of the Delaware River and its tributaries to waters that are free-flowing, clean, healthy, and abundant with a diversity of life.
So Bob Boyle is the original founder of the Riverkeeper concept here in the United States of America. And I know that he pulled the name from England, where it was used historically sort of for other purposes. But when Bob Boyle brought the name here to the United States, it was with the idea of having a person who would help give a river a voice in the human world, who would take primary responsibility, personal responsibility for the protection and the care of that waterway. And in fact, he first founded the concept and the name on the Hudson River. And there was the Hudson Riverkeeper was the first riverkeeper in the nation. But my organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper, was the second riverkeeper in the nation. And we started our organization all the way back to 1988. And it was actually the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, my organization, that helped to inspire the founding of keepers on other waterways across the nation. And originally the growth was slow, but then it became greater. And now you really do have riverkeepers, sound keepers, bay keepers, all over the nation, including for the Puget Sound. I just know that for me, I believe that the river needs a voice, and it needs not just a quiet voice and not just one that's educating others, but a voice that really is willing to rise up and stand in its defense when necessary.
Each waterway has its own opportunities and challenges. The Delaware Riverkeeper evolved out of its own very specific regional challenges and things that the watershed has been facing. It seems what most waterkeepers have in common is fighting fossil fuels, rallying against factory fish farming, protecting watersheds, and policing environmental laws and polluters.
I mean, in terms of how we evolved, we began with this belief that advocacy and litigation is what the river needs. It needs that voice to rise up. In terms of the issues that we work on, the issues that we take on, right, have evolved over the decades that the organization has been in existence. And so while originally it was very much about defending against construction of dams, issues having to do, the Delaware River is actually the largest river east of the Mississippi that has no dams on its main stem. And so we have worked very, very hard to keep it that way, as well as keeping dams off of major tributaries. A lot of focus on preventing development in the floodplain, filling in our rivers and our waterways to support development. We've also had a major focus on restoration. We were doing stream restoration and river restoration with volunteers before our government agencies even knew how to permit that kind of work. So I'm really proud to that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network was on the cutting edge of helping to create that pathway for restoration and engaging communities, not just within the 4 states of the Delaware River watershed, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, but really nationwide. But as time went on, different threats have raised their ugly head in our watershed. In the mid-2000s, fracking came to our watershed states and shortly thereafter tried to force its way into the boundaries of the Delaware River watershed. Because of our decades of work, we actually got one of the first moratoriums ever in place against the fracking industry, but on a watershed basis. And so there is no fracking anywhere within the boundaries of the Delaware River watershed, despite the fact that we have some of the what they call the sweet spots in terms of the gas producing shales. We secured that moratorium in 2010, and we have fought very, very hard to keep it in place over the last decade and turn it into permanent protection. But we've also been fighting the fracking infrastructure, pipelines and compressor stations continue to try to cut through our watershed. Sometimes we've lost the battle, but we are waging the good fight and have set some really important legal precedent that impacts all pipelines across the nation. Right now, one of our battles is against an LNG export facility that would be the first of its kind in the nation, where fracked gas gets delivered by truck and train over large expanses to the export facility.
I've got one of those too, an LNG export facility down the hill from my home that's being built. I will name them out loud. Puget Sound Energy. The evil empire is building a liquefied natural gas facility, which is currently under construction on the ancestral tidelands of the Puyallup tribe. It will be a disaster of toxic emissions locally and a nightmare for communities in British Columbia where the gas will be fracked. LNG is constantly being labeled as a bridge fuel by people who have no imaginations, and the fossil fuel infrastructure to support it is still a multi-decade investment in fossil fuels that we don't have time for. Puget Sound Energy has led a suspicious campaign, including gas advertising campaigns directed at children, blocking local attempts to create public power utility districts, slowing the transition to renewables, and meddling with local elections. On the other end of the pipeline, something like 400 cities and municipalities in over 20 states have passed local resolutions to either ban fracking or instate moratoriums against the practice. While these freezes on fracking seem to send a clear message to the industry and the colluding politicians that support fossil fuel business, they can be somewhat fragile. That is where Maya's training as an attorney can be powerful, and this is why she talks about the importance of litigation for her organization.
On the fracked gas infrastructure front, one of the things that I've done over my years is also founded a national coalition that we call Voices, Victory Over Infrastructure, Clean Energy Instead. And it's actually a coalition of organizations and community groups all over the nation that are fighting fracked gas infrastructure that's regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a particularly abusive agency. And so anybody that might be fighting that infrastructure or finding themselves facing it, I do encourage them to, get back in touch, and we can loop them into that effort where we really are collaborating across the nation to try to put in place necessary reforms against FERC. But it's interesting when you're talking about the Puget Sound, right? You talked about some of the lovely and wonderful species of the Puget Sound that are being fought for there by the Soundkeeper. And of course, we have our wonderful, beautiful species on the Delaware River that are really in jeopardy. We have a genetically unique population of Atlantic sturgeon that exists nowhere else on Earth but in our beautiful Delaware River. And at this point, we have less than 300 spawning adults left. And yet, day in and day out, I have to battle against new threats to that species.
The sturgeon is incredible. It is an ancient living fossil that goes along with alligators and turtles in some way where they just haven't really changed very much since the time of the dinosaurs. The Atlantic sturgeon is an anadromous species, meaning it's a migratory fish. They reproduce in freshwater and will return to the ocean after spawning multiple times. They can get up to 15 feet long in length and live as long as 60 years. The sturgeon is the charismatic mascot for the Waterkeeper Alliance. These fish were once abundant on the eastern coast of the United States, but overfishing, water pollution, and other threats decimated the population. A few years back, Maya authored a book called The Green Amendment, Securing Our Right to a Healthy Environment. The theme of the book revolves around environmental constitutionalism. I feel like I'm a well-educated environmentalist, but I, like almost everyone, never realized we do not have a right to a clean environment. We don't actually have the right. The U.S. Constitution fails to explicitly address environmental protection, as does almost each and every state constitution. For years, scholars and activists have advocated for the constitutionalism of environmental protection at state and national levels, whether via judicial interpretation of existing constitutional provisions or via formal amendment. This might seem like a radical shift to adopt in our constitutions, but some scholars argue the vision for this already is written into the structure of environmental law. Even though we have a broad breadth of environmental laws here in the United States, in so many ways it is hard to assert they are protecting our environment given the scope and scale of environmental change and climate chaos that is occurring. Maya describes how our current portfolio of environmental laws are just sort of mitigating the damage that we allow to happen.
So as a result of my work as the Delaware Riverkeeper, there's this new national movement that I founded, and it's called the Green Amendment Movement. And there's another organization I founded called Green Amendments for the Generations, which is about this idea of advancing green amendments. And you are right. Over the entirety of people's lives, they haven't learned about the right to pure water and clean air, a stable climate and healthy environment, certainly not in the way they've heard about the rights to free speech and freedom of religion, private property rights, even gun rights. And that's because here in the United States of America, as much as people like to believe in their hearts and their minds that they have a right to clean water and clean air, they don't. They don't because it's not enumerated and protected in the Bill of Rights section of our state and federal constitutions. The Green Amendment is putting into the Bill of Rights section of our constitutions nationwide the rights to pure water and clean air, a stable climate, and healthy environments, and writing and framing the amendment such that those environmental rights are given as much recognition and enforceable constitutional protection as those other human, civil, and political rights we hold dear, like the rights to free speech and freedom of religion. And the reason why I had to start this new organization is you don't have this across the nation. There are 2 states, but only 2 states, that have what I call a Green Amendment. One is Pennsylvania, and that's at this point in significant part due to the work of myself and my first organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, but now also Green Amendments for the Generations, and the state of Montana. Other than that, you have a lot of states that talk about the environment in their constitutions, but they don't recognize and protect it as a right. And that's a fundamental failing. And so the Green Amendment, having a Green Amendment is about transforming environmental protection into a constitutionally recognized, protected right, but also transforming, just as you suggested, transforming the way people think about the environment and think about the fact that you should have a right to clean water and clean air, that should be your highest expectation. You shouldn't have to go into meetings and beg that your government officials will do the right thing when it comes to protecting your environment. And in fact, our entire legal structure right now, our entire system of government, when it comes to the environment, is focused on permitting and managing the how, the when, the where we allow pollution and degradation to take place. It is not focused on prevention of harm. And that's because we don't have this recognition of the environment as a right of all people, including future generations, that must be honored and respected and protected from the beginning of the decision-making process, not just left to the end when all we can do is think about how we're going to manage it.
It takes some foresight to consider we are the ancestors of future generations. This is the key to sustainability. At some point in time, folks in Montana and Pennsylvania did a good job of placing language about the right to a healthy environment into the right place in their constitutions. You really cannot get much higher than the Bill of Rights section. These essential rights we hold dear do often get challenged in court. The amendments that guarantee equality for all people and voting rights, they are all challenged and they are subverted. So how adaptable could green amendments be to different states with distinct cultures?
So if you go onto the forthegenerations.org website, people will find that I have a checklist, and it's very adaptable. On the other hand, there are aspects of a green amendment that cannot be sacrificed. For example, it must be in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. And if you take it out of the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, you fundamentally undermine what you will accomplish. And it's not a green amendment. It would not mean that environmental rights are protected the same way we protect those other human, civil, and political rights, which is the whole point of it. And there are other key elements that must be in there. Some of them I highly recommend. What I do is come in with model language, right? So there are different ways the conversation begins, but always part of the beginning of the conversation is to bring to people's attention this model language that I recommend that has all of the key elements of a green amendment. And it should be the starting place for the conversation for that state. It doesn't mean that it's the ending place. And so in fact, every state where we have a green amendment proposal already or one that's about to be proposed, the language is different. And it's different to suit the personalities and the goals of our partners in that state and the personality of that state itself. So there is a lot of opportunity for crafting at the same time. There are a lot of elements that I am, very clear that cannot be sacrificed. So it's a little bit of a give and take. But, I really encourage all communities interested in this idea to get in touch with me at Green Amendments for the Generations, and let's work together to make sure that we get this Green Amendment right, because there are only 2 states that have gotten it right. And even though they got it right, it also didn't mean that those Green Amendments were properly interpreted and implemented from the get-go. We also had to work hard to get the right precedent. And that's what happened in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, Senator Franklin Curry, that had this idea and actually proposed the first Green Amendment. He proposed that and it was passed in 1971. But then for 42 years, the Pennsylvania courts declared it just to be a policy statement. So it really had no legal strength. It was only until I and my organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, used that Green Amendment to challenge a very pro-fracking law that we were able to convince the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to overturn that 42 years of bad precedent and properly interpret and apply the Green Amendment. Long story short, what that means is that means that the environmental rights enumerated in the amendment are given the same legal recognition and protection as those other rights that we hold dear, that same incredible strength and power. So it's really there, as you suggested, there are multiple layers, but it all starts with getting the language right and getting the community to come together around that most powerful language.
Incredible, right? That Pennsylvania Supreme Court case Maya mentioned, she was a lead petitioner in the 2013 landmark Robinson Township versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania case that breathed new life into Pennsylvania's long-ignored environmental rights amendment. And you might ask how this departs from other legislation that we've seen before. The answer is we really haven't, unless we have really been paying attention. The closest thing I can find is legislative efforts to pass environmental justice bills, which have stalled out and proven extremely complex to pass for decades. Through my readings lately, I started to dig into Dina Gilia-Whitaker's book, As Long as Grass Grows. She outlines the multi-decade legislative saga at the federal level pretty succinctly. The first attempt to pass an environmental justice bill, the Environmental Justice Act of 1992, died in committee in both the House and the Senate. The Republican takeover in 1994 thwarted efforts to pass this progressive legislation. In most recent history, subsequent attempts went sideways in 2007 and again in 2011 with a proposal by former Illinois Democratic Representative Jesse Jackson Jr. to amend the Constitution, proposing an amendment to the Constitution of the United States respecting the right to a clean, safe, and sustainable environment. I will put a link to that in the show notes and show description. Not in the United States, but in other parts of the world, people have actually granted rights to nature. Ecuador is the first country to recognize rights of nature in its constitution. I asked Maya if green amendments were the same or fundamentally different from these other efforts to grant rights to nature itself.
A green amendment is fundamentally different than the concept of rights of nature. You're right. In other countries, they have recognized rights of nature. They've also recognized environmental rights of people. But all those different countries have their own legal structure and strategy. I believe in the concept of rights of nature very deeply and emotionally. And I think it's powerful and I think it's important, but it is not what a green amendment is. And really what rights of nature, for example, people may have heard about the effort to give the Colorado River its own rights. If that effort had succeeded, it would have resulted in giving the river itself what we call standing in court, which means when the river was being harmed because somebody was violating the law, the river, with its own legal counsel, could go into the courtroom and enforce against the violator of that law. The thing is, with rights of nature, as powerful as the concept is emotionally and conceptually, and in the recognition that nature itself is a living, breathing, growing entity that's part of our world, if all you have are sucky laws on the books to enforce, then I don't know how much you really gained legally for the protection of nature. When we, the people, passed the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, right, we were giving government permission to govern over us. But in the Bill of Rights section, what we said to government is, look, you can govern over us, but there are these rights in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution that as you govern, you may not govern in a way that infringes on those rights. You may not infringe on a right to free speech or a right to freedom of religion, on these fundamental civil rights that we recognize, on property rights, on gun rights. Well, what we're saying now by adding a Green Amendment is saying when you govern over us, you may not infringe on our environmental rights. Now, in terms of the laws that we have on the books, that means if a law itself, when it's implemented, will infringe on environmental rights, the Constitution can be used to challenge it. If you have a good law on the books that's improperly applied in a way that continues to create environmental sacrifice zones where communities of color and indigenous communities are sacrificed in order to protect other richer, whiter communities, well, that would result in a violation of the constitutional rights of those people through how that law is implemented. So you can use the Constitution to challenge that implementation. If you have a place where there is no law to address some sort of environmental harm, like a lot of people may have heard of PFAS, PFOA, chemical contamination of drinking water supplies. man-made family of chemicals industry was allowed to use in a way that got into the environment and into people's drinking water. Well, that all happened because there were no laws in place to prevent that harm. If you had a Green Amendment in one of those states, right, you could have used the Constitution. Even though there was an absence of law, you could have used that constitutional right to seek and secure critical protections. So what a Green Amendment does is we always have to remember the Constitution is above all the laws we have, how they're enforced, and even if there's a gap in the law, where they're missing. And so we can always turn to the Constitution to hold government accountable for behaving in a way that will result in the violation of the constitutional rights of the people. It's fundamentally about the relationship between people and their government, and recognizing they have these inalienable rights that are birthrights, right? By virtue of the fact that you were born, and that we are making clear to government, you may not take those inalienable rights from us in how you behave, either directly or what you allow others to do. Mm-hmm. And I would suggest to you, as much as I value the rights of nature mindset and process and recognitions, I think that by having a Green Amendment in all of our state and federal constitutions, we are dramatically raising the bar on environmental protection in ways that will really give nature that higher level of recognition, respect, and care that it is deserving of. And what we are finding in the states where we have Green Amendment proposals is we can get all partisan support for it, because, all political parties want to see their children and grandchildren have the ability to go to the faucet and get a glass of water that's not going to give them cancer. The power belongs to the people. And government, we gave you some of that power so you could govern, but we didn't give it all to you. And there are all these rights that we kept unto ourselves, and you cannot infringe upon them. And that is an incredible place of strength for people to battle for their environmental rights if they have that constitutional positioning and recognition.
More than a few people might believe in the concept of rights of nature very deeply and emotionally, just as Maya noted. People will say water is life and actually mean it. While this is way too woo for some people, one could get into the Tree Hugger Wayback Machine and hear Julia Plevin in the Forest Bathing episode discuss the original instructions, which are ancient ways of living followed by many indigenous societies. Botanist and author Robin Wall Kimmerer details this orientation expertly in her book Braiding Sweetgrass too. This is probably worth a whole episode by itself at some point in the future, but I want to wander here briefly because I went down a bit of a rabbit hole on researching this issue. Rights we probably should be guaranteed may very well not show up in your own Bill of Rights, but they may be embodied in numerous United Nations declarations or resolutions as common standards for all peoples and all nations. The Human Rights Council established the mandate for the independent expert on human rights and the environment in 2012. As recently as 2018, Mr. David R. Boyd, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, issued and recommended that the time has come for the UN to formally recognize the human right to a healthy environment, whereby creating more universal protections and to fill a gap in the architecture of international human rights. We have yet to give nature standing in court because we do not have the vocabulary for it, perhaps. Our laws and other cultural artifacts reflect the dominant culture's perceptions of and relationship with nature, which is not reciprocal. As Maya noted, more recently, a 2017 lawsuit in the U.S. District Court in Denver asked a judge to treat the Colorado River as a person rather than property, recognizing its right, quote-unquote, to exist, flourish, regenerate, and naturally evolve. The Colorado River as an ecosystem was the plaintiff in the case, with people such as the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund listed as guardians to act on the river's behalf. The river and its friends were seeking to set precedents for future lawsuits that could hold the government responsible for certain actions or inactions that have caused the river harm. I just said we don't have a language for it, or maybe we do have something analogous by giving rights to non-people. The river and its supporters made the argument that if corporations in the U.S. can be granted the same rights as people, couldn't rivers be allowed that status as well? Maya mentions partisanship, and while our politicians, especially in campaign season, like to delineate political divisions, we do have values we hold in common. We are talking about this within spitting distance of our election in the United States. Beyond the 2020 election, I'm sure Maya has a long game, and she has a great team working with her. I asked her how she sees the movement playing out past the next election. Does this issue have the potential to bridge the gap in the aisle?
So that's why I use the language all partisan, right? Mm-hmm. Because to give recognition that there are not just two parties. There are other political parties, right? There's the Green Party, there's the Tea Party, right? There are other parties that pop up in different places, in different spaces at different times. And so the point is to say that the right to a clean and healthy environment is beyond politics. And yes, when we're talking about specific environmental protections and specific laws, very, very often it can get very partisan, right? When you're talking about those specific issues. But one of the beauties about the Green Amendment concept, while it is incredibly powerful in every context for environmental protection, fundamentally, when you're talking about the passage of a Green Amendment, you are talking to your legislators, you are talking to your community members, whoever is the right decision maker in that state. You are talking about the right to clean water and clean air. And you are daring them to say, I will not support that because I do not think you, your children, your grandchildren, your friends, your neighbors, your dog are entitled to clean and healthy water. That's a pretty bold position to take. So it's a different conversation than should we pass a law to stop fracking, right? To ban fracking. That's a different conversation fundamentally from the get-go than should we pass a constitutional amendment that recognizes the rights of all people to clean water. This system of government where we are focused on permitting pollution and degradation has been the mainstay of environmental protection since environmental legislation came to be here in the United States of America. This is a long problem where we failed to recognize the constitutional right to a healthy environment. And as a result, allowed a system of government to grow up that is willing to sacrifice our environment and only think about how to manage its degradation at the end of the decision-making process. So however the federal election goes, however any state election goes, we need this constitutional recognition of environmental rights. Now, the Green Amendments for the Generation strategy is about starting at the states, right? Constitutional amendments are much more accessible at the state level. They're very, very meaningful because there is so much that the states do that directly impacts the health and safety of our environment, whether you're talking about water, air, climate, forests, wetlands, animals, plants. And so passing green amendments that will control what is happening at the state level is critically important. We also have to remember, right, there are those two layers. So here in the United States of America, there's a lot of power placed with the states, but then there is also a lot of power placed with the federal government. And our federal constitution is what holds to account our Congress and our federal agencies and our president. And so in addition to having state green amendments that hold state legislators and governors and agencies accountable, we ultimately need to get a federal green amendment. But I believe that we start with the states because a lot happens at the state level. Constitutional amendments, as I said, are much more accessible at the state level. We are going to have a much better chance of getting green amendments passed in the near term. In fact, right now, we already have 5 green amendment proposals in 5 states under consideration. Doesn't mean it's going to be an easy lift to pass them. Okay. So we have proposals in New York, New Jersey, Vermont, Maryland, and West Virginia. And I'm anticipating green amendment proposals in the near term in New Mexico, in Oregon. We are having active and growing conversations and initiatives with community groups and or legislators in Colorado, in Maine, in Washington, in Hawaii, in Delaware, in Connecticut, in Kentucky. We've had some conversations. So this is there's a lot of energy, growing for this movement, and the call for our time and our attention and our work is fast outpacing the resources that I have. And so part of my job is really getting to funders and making clear to them that how powerful this pathway for environmental protection is, that this is a positive pathway for environmental protection, that this can help address all of the environmental issues, positive and negative, that we are facing, right? This is a defense against bad things happening, but it's also a sort of a proactive sword to help advance good things, right? Good laws, good restoration initiatives. So we're working very, very hard. I'm very excited about it, but it is daunting because it is sorely, sorely needed, regardless of what happens in November.
So, the intersections. Where do green amendments meet voting rights, for example? By the time this episode airs, 60 million people will have voted in advance of our election. With challenges from voter suppression to COVID, etc., there are major barriers to elect people who actually represent our values and who will follow through on securing our rights to a healthy environment. Look around our community and neighborhoods. Where do you see an incursion of coal plants, factories, or refineries? Maybe you don't see it. Do you ever question how some neighborhoods resist polluting businesses while other low-income areas or BIPOC communities have more pollutant producers, sometimes next door to schools or playgrounds? How do we navigate white supremacy that not only spawns things like climate denialism, but also racialized environmental inequality that enables pollution and degradation focused on communities of Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
So a green amendment is a vitally important part of the call for systemic reform to address racial justice issues. Whether you're talking about environmental justice, you're talking about healthcare, you're talking about education, you're talking about police reform, you're talking about voting. There's this massive, beautiful, powerful, and long overdue coming together of voices demanding that all of those violations of the rights of Black people and brown people and Native American people and others, that we need systemic reform to address all of those violations of our rights and our inequities. People are starting to recognize, and communities of color have known this for a long time, that the unfair burdening to higher levels of pollution have made them much more susceptible to things like COVID, and the lack of access to healthcare has made them much more susceptible to the devastating harms of these kinds of health impacts. And so if we can address the underlying pollution and degradation that makes communities of color more vulnerable while we're addressing healthcare reforms, for example, that is a powerful combination. It's also important for education. There's so much research showing how air pollution is actually harming the ability of children in the schools to learn, which doesn't just affect the quality of their education today, but it affects the quality of their lives going into the future. So this call for systemic reform must include environmental reform. And I agree with you that the ability to access the voting booth when we're talking about advancing green amendments is very, very important. Every state has its sort of own pathway to constitutional amendments. But ultimately, it comes back to the people in one form or another to make it into the voting booth and to vote to advance those constitutional protections.
I will admit, I did ask, what would a green amendment mean for me as a restorationist? It is some speculative fiction to imagine a world where we have the right to a clean, safe, and sustainable environment. Where does that leave ecological restoration? We are fixing all the damage that has been done from centuries of harm, so I think we do have some job security, though restoration is often enabled through a vast array of environmental laws, policies, and programs, presupposing that we are going to do damage or allow a certain amount of damage to be done, but we'll fix it along the way.
Wouldn't it be awesome if you as an environmental restoration person and me as an environmental advocate got put out of a job?
Yeah, right? What would I do?
That's the goal. That is the goal. Like, I would be happy if I could go
out of a job.
That's right. If I could go sell shoes, right? And the people were protected the way they needed to be. If we didn't have environmental justice issues anymore, that would be a grand, grand day. Lawyering was never anywhere. It was never in my family anywhere. My father was a scientist. My mother was a mathematician. So I didn't even know that there was such a thing as environmental law until I got into college. And I asked a professor, I took a law class on a lark, contracts, and I really enjoyed it. And I had always been over my life as a child and as a young adult, somebody who did try to fix inequities, right? Whether it was somebody being bullied or whether it was an animal I found on the side of the road, right? That had been hit by a car or something else had happened, or, when I saw damage being done to the nearby forest and wetlands. It was just that standing up for nature and standing against injustice, I think is just part of who I am. And when I got into college and I found through sad experience, because I didn't do well in class, that as much as I thought I wanted to be a scientist, that really wasn't going to be my path. I enjoyed it and I learned, but I just I wasn't going to be a PhD like my father. But then I found this real interest in the law, and that I would have the ability to pair my belief in environmental protection with the law. That was like a very powerful moment for me. And that's what set me on my path. And that's why I tell young people often come to me and they say, well, I want to do what you do. Don't I have to go to law school, or what do I have to do? And I say, look, there is no one thing you have to do, right? If you enjoy science or engineering, if you're an artist, if you like the law, if you are a mathematician, whatever your personal passion is, study that, hone that, right? Become successful in that, and you compare it with your love of the earth and the environment and your efforts to restore or protect the environment. Because there is a place and a space in the environmental movement, whether it's restoration or protection or otherwise, for every single one of those bodies of knowledge. We need them all to be successful. In advocacy, when I'm at a public hearing and I go up and I'm testifying and doing my thing, and yes, people are very, happy because I've fought the good fight, but I'll tell you, some of the most powerful testimony I have ever heard at a public meeting was somebody who quietly walked up to the microphone and recited a poem they wrote, or sang a song they wrote, or came up with when you went to the climate march, any climate march in any state, what's the most powerful messaging that you see of how urgent it is to protect the environment? It comes from the artists and the art that they bring. Sometimes it's visual art, sometimes it's performance art that they bring to those protests. So there's a space in the environmental movement for all of us. You just need to take your own personal passion, hone it, and pair it up with your love for the earth, and you will find your path. When you have a constitutional right to a healthy environment, you no longer need somebody to give you permission to speak about its impact on your daily life, or how you feel, or the quality of your life, or your fears for your children, right? You are empowered to make that the priority, because what you're saying to government, this is my inalienable right. You can't take this from me. And whatever it is that my right to clean water and clean air, a stable climate and healthy environments means to me, that is to be given priority status, because that is mine. It also has an emotional importance, an intellectual value to people and to advocates, because it shifts the way they think about and they talk about the environment and their rights to a healthy environment. It's no longer going in and pleading your government officials will do the right thing. It's about going in and demanding they do the right thing, because this is your right. This is your constitutional right that they are talking about taking away from you. When I go in and speak to groups, community groups, even legislators about this idea of having a constitutional right to a healthy environment, I just watch the gears change in their brain from what the heck is this to, oh my gosh, how do we not already have this? I mean, it's very empowering. And I always tell people I am willing to go anywhere, anytime to talk about the power and importance of green amendments and constitutional recognition and protection of environmental rights. So if you have a community group, an organization that you are a part of, a church group, a civic group, large or small, where you want to share this message, please, please, please get in touch with Green Amendments for the Generations. And I will personally come and help you have that conversation with your community, right? Like share the message and then work with you to nurture it along in your state.
That is such a gracious offer, and I think you should take her up on it. I don't know how she does it, but Maya seems to be incredibly busy as the chief operating officer of the Delaware River, while also circling around the U.S. rallying people around the idea of green amendments. I asked Maya how she stays centered. It seems like she definitely has a deep down passion for doing things which are right and speaking on behalf of the earth. I was curious how she keeps it all together.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple things. First off, whenever I'm feeling tired or overwhelmed, I remind myself and I say it out loud, I love my life. And I am truly, truly honored to be able to do the work of fighting for the earth and the environment and communities every single day. That is an honor. And I am grateful for that honor and I'm grateful for that opportunity. And I do truly love my life. So I remind myself of that on those, if I am feeling overwhelmed. And the other thing is, the truth is, when I'm having a bad moment, if I want to sit down or run away, because I'm tired, well, what is that going to accomplish, right? Like, I don't have the luxury of that. The moment is now. And when a threat is being faced to the forest or the river or the climate, that's happening now. I also have a wonderful husband who's very supportive. And when I do say, oh my gosh, Dave, I have there's another talk and I'm just going to be here. Can I make it to there? He says, Maya, you have to say yes to everything. Because when it comes to green amendments for the generations, the moment is now. You're trying to build this movement now. When people want to hear from you, when people want your support, when they need your engagement, you have to say yes. And there's something about, having his loving support and encouragement that really helps me move along. And then, of course, I do have a wonderful team at Green Amendments for the Generations. It's a very small team right now. It needs to grow. We're trying to grow it. But I will tell you that Bridget and Molly and Colleen are fabulous, fabulous people. And they get it. And they have so much, positive energy that contributes to this work. And so they too sort of help me motor along and manage everything. The other thing that I have is this sort of also lovely plan for growth and continuation. I have this amazing daughter, Annika, who I am so pleased, and this is by her choice, not by my choice, who really seems to be following in my footsteps. And so I have great confidence. She's right now in law school. She is studying the environment, environmental advocacy. And whenever she has an opportunity, she comes and works with Green Amendments for the Generations, as well as the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And so we're sort of building this support for the future. My son is only 14. He still wants to do stuff with the stars and the moon, but he's very much an advocate for the critters, particularly the wolves. So we'll see what path that he brings along. But it's not just this wonderful husband I have, but it's these wonderful two kids that I have that are really very much part of my life and integrated into my environmental work. And that helps bring balance, and to be able to watch them craft a piece of testimony and deliver it, or aspire to doing something good for the wolves or for the earth or for the river. That too just, is very rewarding. And so I just get all these little bits and pieces from here and there. But I think the most important thing, again, I love my life and it's an honor to do this work.
Now, the one thing I ask everyone is what their favorite tree is. I like trees, of course, but it often provides an insight into my guests' sense of place. I often see people open up and it ends the show on a high note.
my specific tree or a species of tree?
It could be either way. It's very ambiguous, and yeah, you could feel free to be creative. Yeah, sometimes people name like Arbutus menziesii. It doesn't have to be that. It could be like a concept tree.
Well, what's that fantastic book, right? The Secret Life of Trees.
Oh yeah,
Amazing book. If somebody hasn't yet experienced that book, fabulous, well worth it. Also, Last Child in the Woods. But I mention that because The Secret Life of Trees talks about the connectivity between all the trees and their populations. And I really feel that, and I really see that with nature. When I'm going to give a talk, even before this podcast, I go out and I find the nearest tree or shrub or flower, and I physically connect with it so that I have that grounding of remembering that I'm not speaking for Maya. I am there trying to give the earth a voice in our human world. So there isn't one tree. Certainly in my garden, which is an all native plant garden for the East Coast, was grass when I bought it, and I've transformed it with my husband and my kids' help to a nice, lovely native landscape for the pollinators as well as for us. And I will say amongst my favorite species of tree, and there are multiple of each of these in my garden, but sweet bay magnolias I do love, and fringe trees. Now, the other thing is, I think that those two have pretty much the staying power, sweet bay magnolias and fringe trees. So the sweet bay magnolia gets really a flower that fits in your hand, right? Very fragrant. Mm-hmm. The fringe tree, its flowers are very delicate. It's these little white bits and there are a whole bunch of them. When the fringe tree goes into bloom, you have the green of the leaves, but like this whole white hue around the whole tree, because you've got all these little flowers that are coming out at the same time. But a red buckeye too. Red buckeye. So the bottle brush buckeye is the shrub, but the red buckeye is the tree. That's another fabulous one with those fronds of red. So yeah, I could go on this for a long time.
No, this is great. I don't think I've had too many East Coasters on the podcast. So yeah, getting this other side of the country perspective on trees is great.
Well, the sad thing is, right? Like one of the sad things about gardening now is wherever you go in the world, right? Like it seems like all the non-natives get picked up and plopped everywhere. And so like we've lost we've lost the differences in the beauty of the plants from one community to another, because we just bringing these same ugly arborvitae things, whatever, everywhere, like that kind of stuff. So I really, really enjoy the different native plants of a region and enjoy seeing what they are, as opposed to seeing what people bought at the local Home Depot, which gets sold at every Home Depot across the nation. So I am actually staying at an Airbnb, and nearby there's a nice natural area. But it's just a few trees, and most of it is sort of low growing. And then off in the distance is the mountains. New Mexico is just, I had never been to New Mexico until my Green Amendments for the Generations work. I came here for the first time in the summer of 2019 and just found amazing energy, which is why we're really working hard in New Mexico. But they call it the land of enchantment, right? And I really see why. New Mexico is incredibly, incredibly beautiful and unique in terms of the plants and culturally, and just fabulous, a fabulous place to be.
Well, thank you so much to Maya van Rossum. I feel like there are so many opportunities to continue to share this story. The effort is not short of challenges, but Maya really is a hero. I hope she stays grounded amongst the craziness of the Green Amendment campaigns. It seems like she has a great family, great kids, and an incredible team behind her. It's promising to hear about what they're going to be rolling into as they follow this common thread from state to state. Join me on the next Tree Hugger episode for the 1-year anniversary show. I am bringing back Microbes in the Universe. My first guest on the podcast, Jacob Mills. I can barely grasp that a year has gone by. I appreciate you all supporting the show over this time. Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for information about Maya van Rossum. Find us online at treehuggerpod.com and social media at treehuggerpod. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. That was the soothing sounds of DJ Williams you heard on this episode. I found his music on the YouTube audio library. Thanks for hanging out. Now go vote.